You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast.
What are some of the primary lessons that you've learned from, let's say those first two, one or two projects that you took on that have, affected the way that you approach projects now, and I'm sure into the future too?
Well, I have a lot, honestly.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
It's crazy. Like, I love talking about lessons learned because whatever I can share that can help someone else dodge a pothole in the future is going to be, that much more valuable. But one of the biggest pieces for me has been the lack of understanding that business plan from now until 5 years from now. And I think that there's a lack of forward thinking when it comes to building out the cannabis company, whether that's a vertically integrated company or just an entity in cultivation or processing or retail. You have to think forward. You have to think, where am I going to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because there's going to be expansion capabilities there that you may be restricted in your infrastructure. And then you may be looking at a large, capital raising at that point, because now you recognize, okay, we're doing better than we projected. Now we need to bring in an extra extractor. Now we need to add another 25,000 square foot greenhouse. Now we need to expand our dispensary because we have way too much volume to handle. Those are things I think from my first early on projects, you have to think forward. You have to say, am I going to always be here? And this is my product yield month over month. This is what I want to create and produce. Or do you want to see yourself growing into a larger entity, a larger brand, having more brand recognition across your market? Maybe that market's going to extend into other states. Maybe it's going to extend globally if you're in the hemp space, So I think that's a huge lesson learned, that people really just don't think forward enough to be able to account for it with their infrastructure build. And that's really an easy one to think about in the beginning. I stress, I'm a licensed project manager, so I really stress spending the most time during your planning and initiation phase. You have to spend that time in the planning phase, just reiteration after reiteration of just going over any of the risks. How are we going to mitigate those risks? What do our expansions look like? What do the growth look like for, not just the model itself, but the building, the people? How are we going to manage a staff and still stay connected to them at 100 employees versus 20? So those are things that you absolutely have to think about, the growth of the business. Where am I going to be? Another lesson learned that I think is extremely important is the budget. I think that a lot of the time people will see the huge dollar signs that this billion-dollar industry can afford someone, jumping into the market and grabbing a license, and they will shortchange on their budget for their CapEx and their OpEx. And they'll look at it and they'll say, okay, I can cut corners here and, maybe cut down on the salaries and save some money there. I can cut down on the automation of my equipment and only bring in this for now. I'm going to get started now. But then they don't think about how labor intensive a lot of these processes are when you are lacking that level of automation. I mean, back in the day with the CO2 extractors, for instance, you would have to have literally 2 people in that room 24/7 or however long your shifts were operating, manually opening and closing the supply valve from the CO2 into the extraction chamber, watching the pressures, manually going over the gauges there and having to, make sure that you're at the proper operating levels for that. And if you're not, then now you got to go back and you got to mitigate that. And then you could have messed up your entire batch. So now that has to get redone or reprocessed. And that it hits into your profit margins every single month. And if you're not mindful of those things, I love, like, when I have projects approach me, I always tell them that you need to spend the most money in your equipment, your compliance piece of that equipment and your infrastructure and your staff. That is where you're going to spend the most money. But unfortunately, I always see it flipped where they'll spend the least amount of money in the compliance piece, the equipment and the staff, and then they'll go heavy on the cultivars that I want to grow. They'll go heavy on packaging, like all the packaging's got to look really great and badass. And then they'll go heavy on marketing and the marketing strategy and getting those things out there, website look fantastic. And then you'll show up to the actual site and it's this little 3,000 square foot makeshift warehouse thing where, half of it got blown up last week because of the CO2 tubes are rubbing together and you got friction. It's nuts. It doesn't make any sense.
Yes, you are describing things I have personally experienced. Yes, I can concur with everything that you're saying. And especially like my focus was sort of in the quality management and compliance piece mixed in with the analytical side. And that I struggled so hard to get clients to understand the value of figuring your quality management system out at the beginning rather than trying to implement it years later when your culture has already been defined. Your patterns of behavior are already there. It is so hard to change all of that once it's set. And I've heard the same thing. Well, no, we have to do this now so we can get running, and then we'll come back to that. And, what you were describing on the first point that you brought up of just the forward thinking, an exercise that I try to get my clients to do, it's a part of ISO 9001, but context of the organization. So what are your risks? What are your opportunities? Who are your stakeholders? Sometimes companies don't even think about that. Like they just think, well, I mean, it's the people that work here and the people that run the company. Well, no,
not at all.
It's hard. And so how do you convince people to value those things?
It's difficult. It really is. And honestly, I have a very sharpshooter type of directive towards that. I don't sugarcoat things for people. I don't take on projects that aren't willing to listen to me. If they're, not willing to listen to the expertise that I've gained, not only with the 5 years that I've been in the industry, but just as a whole, as a scientist, then that to me is going to be a huge red flag in the relationship that we're starting. Quite a few people who are non-scientists think that they have it all figured out because they have, excess capital, or they've watched a couple YouTube videos where they think that they can make an acid-base reaction happen like this. It's just, they look at an HPLC like a blender or a toaster where, they're just going to put something in, hit a button, and it's going to come out. And that has been such a huge problem in trying to be very forward with clients and let them know, like, hey, I understand that you have an understanding, but it's wrong. And I'm so sorry that, your mother didn't tell you can't sing and they let you go on the talent show. That's what it is. And so I feel as if, if you're very transparent, if you're extremely honest, and you have data to back that up. That's one of the things that's different from our consulting firm and others that are out there. There's a lot of consulting firms that are out there literally Googling SOPs, pasting and copying and putting them together and selling them for thousands and thousands of dollars to people and putting people at risk with their companies. Versus with me, I actually have hands-on experience running extractors of multiple manufacturers to tell you what the throughput's going to be for CBD heavy material, for THC heavy material. What is it going to look like to even fractionate during that process? What are you going to get when you go and you set up your HPLC for potency? What are those consumables? What's the throughput of that? I think that's real world data that will convince anyone. If you can put it on paper and say, hey, here it is. This is the proof. And if you allow me to, I can show you a plan and a model that's going to get you to where you would like to be, but it's going to take you in a very methodical way. And it's also going to point out all of the pieces of compliance and regulatory considerations that you need to have operating in what can be a risky and dangerous environment. Because a lot of people don't think about that. I'm really happy at the strides that we've made just in extraction alone, from where it was 20 years ago, where people were blowing up every week, in labs and garages in the middle of forests and all these different things, doing open blasting extraction with hydrocarbons. Now people are starting to really understand that this is a scientific space. It takes a level of knowledge and a level of consideration to compliance and safety and risk to understand what it is you're even getting in bed with. If you don't want to do those things, if you want to just play stoner scientist, then my recommendation is do it solventlessly. Everybody can do it that way. And that way you're not putting anyone at risk. I have personally been involved in an explosion. And it was nothing that we could have really predicted. It was just literally the way the extractor and the pump was set up. And there was friction happening between the hoses from the pump to the extractor to where one day it just spontaneously broke. Yeah. And there was a large combustion. And the nice thing is no one was in the facility at the time. This was an overnight run. And we had all of these different sensors to be able to shut things down whenever, you get to a certain level, a maximum exposure level. And you have your firemen and everybody else, your first responders that are coming on site immediately. But again, you have to plan for those things. Yes. You have to have a safety plan and say, okay, not if, but when this happens, what am I going to do about it to not only protect my product, my business, but my people? Yeah. My people. Like, that's the biggest piece. So I do think you have to be transparent and very straightforward with people.
We must work untiringly so that our children are obliged to learn the truth. Because it is only through knowledge that we can safely protect them.
You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast.